Turn to Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6, we're going to pick up reading in verse 25 tonight. And we're going to make our way as we read through the passage as we go through the message. And this is part 1, all right? So you're going to have to wait for 2 weeks to get part 2, all right? Because next week, of course, we have the hymn night. And so anyway, so this is part 1. But I won't leave you hanging. We'll have some closure with it in a little bit. As a reminder as to where we are in the Old Testament, we are making our way through the Old Testament. We're looking at different stories and different characters and different things that God used throughout the Old Testament, things that are recorded for us. And where we are at this point, we're in the book of Judges. We're watching as the Israelites are once again on that cycle. That circle, if you've ever seen a diagram with this, just kind of picture that in your mind. It was the same thing over and over as you go throughout the book of Judges. The Israelites would be serving God faithfully. And then for some crazy reason, and let's don't judge them because we're guilty of it sometimes too, they wandered away from God. They would get away from God, and many times they would fall into sin, particularly idolatry. And then in order to wake them up, God would allow some invading enemy to come in and to capture them, to oppress them for a while, and they would cry out to God. And once they cried out to God, God, of course, in His graciousness and His mercy, He would hear their cry. He would send a deliverer, and here in this book they are called judges. And they would come in, they would point God's people back into the right direction, back toward God. They would deliver God's people, and then they would go back right into serving God again. And so they followed that cycle over and over again. In our last message, we saw that God chose to use this time a man by the name of Gideon. And he is going to deliver God's people from a group of people called the Midianites. And the Midianites were not a good group of folks. When they came in to invade, they just wiped everything out. They were likened to locusts. When they would come in, they would just take everything. They would burn everything. And as we found with Gideon a couple weeks ago, God's people went into hiding. They were afraid what little they had left would be taken from them, or they would be captured. But yet when God comes to Gideon, and remember we said that we believe that this was probably Old Testament appearance of Christ to Gideon, and spoke to Gideon about what he would have him to do. He was going to be the deliverer. He was going to be the judge. And do you remember what God called him? A mighty man of valor. And of course, we said that didn't describe Gideon at all at the time. At the time he was called this, he was not. He was a mighty man in cowardice, maybe. He was in hiding. He wasn't standing up for anything. But God called him a mighty man of valor. Why? Because God saw where He wanted to take him. And so God was going to take him on this journey very patiently to use him and his life and to take him to that place of being a mighty man of valor. In the text before us, it records the second time that the Lord appeared to Gideon. I like what Matthew Henry said about this. He said, God's visits, if gratefully received, shall be graciously repeated. Bid God welcome, and He will come again. In other words, when God comes to you and He speaks to your heart, welcome Him. Say, God, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad that you're speaking to me. Out of all the people you could be speaking to, you're speaking to me. I welcome you into my life. I welcome you into my world. I want to hear your voice. Matthew Henry, and of course the Bible certainly teaches this, if we welcome God, He'll come again. He'll come back and visit, and He'll come back to say some more to us later on. And so when God comes back again, this is the second time. When God had appeared to Gideon the first time, you remember Gideon gave him honor. He presented a present to him. Back in chapter 6, verse 18, he made an altar to God and presented a present to God. And so now God comes to Gideon and speaks to him. Now notice, the Lord doesn't wait a long time for this second visit. Notice verse 25. And it came to pass, look at the next couple words, the same night. The same night is what? The same night as the day that he came to Gideon the first time. So he speaks to Gideon. He's in hiding. Thou mighty man of valor. Okay, Lord, I'm going to give you this altar. I'm going to give you this present. I'm listening. And then God comes back and visits with him again that night. And he talks with him a little more. I love how patient God was with Gideon. He didn't unload on him all at one time. And he doesn't do this with us either. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. I am so thankful that God did not unload on me everything that he wanted to do in my life all at once. As a teenager, when he first called me, if God would have said, hey, you're going to be a church planter, you're going to be a pastor, you're going to be a youth pastor, you're going to do all these, no way. No way. I'd have been like Jonah. I'd have run in the other direction. But God is so patient. And he is so patient with all of us. And he gives it to us little bit by little bit, step by step. And that's what he does with Gideon. On the night of the same day that he spoke to Gideon the first time he comes back. Now keep in mind, again, that God is moving Gideon through this process of faith and trust. It takes a while to earn trust. You know, it takes a while to give trust. It takes a while for your faith to grow. And so this is the first step in the process to bring about reformation. And where does this process begin? It begins in his own family. In his own family. Look again at verse 25. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it. And build an altar unto the Lord thy God upon the top of the rock, in the ordered place, and take the second bullock, and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove, which thou shalt cut down. Now there's a lot there, and we're going to unpack it, and we're going to look at it, all right? So these are the orders that God gives to Gideon, and these are a test for Gideon. There's going to be some more testing later on. There's going to be some bigger testing. But this is a small test. And it's like God is saying to Gideon, if you can pass this small test, it's like when you went to school. You didn't get a test on your first day of school in kindergarten, on world history or on biology or on algebra 2 or something like that. No, the teacher hopefully was patient with you and said, okay, today we're going to talk about our ABCs. And you learned your ABCs, and you learned how to count, and you went through that process. That is what God here is doing with Gideon. These are the orders, the very first test that Gideon is going to have concerning his commitment to God. Would Gideon be obedient or not? That's the title of the message tonight. Obedient or not? And by the way, that's the question that God has for each of us tonight. Are we going to be obedient or not? It might be a small test. It might be a mighty big test. But are we going to be obedient to him? F.B. Meyer said this, we are first tested in the less before being called to the greater. You see, before Gideon can deliver a nation, he must first deliver his own family. So I want us to look at several things about what God told him to do in these orders. Notice, first of all, these orders were very specific and very clear. They were not vague at all. Gideon didn't have to come back to God and say, now God, I don't understand exactly what you're telling me to do here. No, these were very specific. These were very clear orders. What were these commands or orders? Well, first of all, God said, destroy the altar of Baal. And particularly, it was his daddy's altar. Look, everybody during this time, just about, the worship of Baal was widespread. Everybody, it seemed like the whole nation of Israel was involved in this. There were altars to Baal all over the countryside. One of those altars, as we're told here, belonged to Gideon's father. It was probably not his personal altar. It was probably an altar for his entire family. So here's a man leading his entire family in pagan worship. He knew better. All of God's people knew better, but that's what was going on. Right beside this altar to Baal, and keep in mind, Baal was the masculine god. He was the man, if you want to look at it, but then you had what would be the female goddess, and her name was Ashtaroth. And we don't see that name here in this passage of Scripture, but we see her presence. Notice here, right beside the altar of Baal stood the images. Here it's translated with the word grove. These were in honor of the female goddess Ashtaroth. She was considered the goddess of fertility. Now, these groves, they look like poles. In other words, they were made out of trees. They would skin the trees, take all the branches off the trees, and they would leave them in the ground and cut them off and shape them and form them and sculpt them into some type of image, or they would chop the tree down and make the idol or the image and put them back in the ground or stand them up. And so we've all heard of a grove of trees. Well, this is where they got this from. It was a grove of idols. Just idols everywhere setting out. And so you had the altar of Baal, which was made of stone. You had the grove, which was made of wood. Gideon's orders were to do what? To throw down the altar of Baal. And to cut down the images of Ashtaroth. In other words, he was not to show any compromise whatsoever when it came toward idolatry. Don't show any compromise. Now, that's the way God deals with wickedness. All the way through the Bible, that's the way God deals with it. But that's not the way that we deal with it many times. You see, when we are confronted with wickedness, we have this tendency to listen to what the world says we ought to do. And the world says you ought not to judge. You ought not to judge. It doesn't matter if it's false. It doesn't matter if it's wicked, it's corrupt, it's sinful. You shouldn't judge other people. In other words, you shouldn't say anything about it. That's what we're being told. And that's what we have a tendency of doing sometimes. We have a tendency to listen to that. We are told to be sensitive. We are told to be tolerant of false views that others may have. The mantra of our day is, why can't we just all get along? And by the way, that is not just in the business place and in the social areas, but that's also coming to the church today. Why can't we just all get along? Why can't the Baptist worship with the Catholic? I mean, have you heard it? There is this ecumenical movement that's pushed forward. It's been going on a long time. It's just gaining steam. Hey, we shouldn't judge anybody. I mean, after all, don't we all worship the same God anyway? I'm sorry, we don't. We don't worship the same God. We don't worship the same Savior. We believe in two different things when it comes to salvation. But if we're going to have God's blessing on our life and in our family and in our world, we have to deal firmly with sin just like God tells us we ought to. There's no room for compromise. If we're going to be completely obedient to God, the altars of sin must be thrown down, must be cut down, and that starts first in our own home. You say, preacher, I don't have any altars in my home to other things. You got a TV? What comes across your TV? What comes across your computer? What comes across your phone? We can have altars and not even realize they're there. What kind of music you listening to? We can have altars, and they come into our home, and we're not even paying them any, but they're there. And I promise you, they are affecting your effectiveness for God. They're affecting your life personally and the rest of your family. What should we do? The same thing as God told Gideon. We should take evil out of the way. But notice, not only should he destroy the altar of Baal, but he was to build the altar of Jehovah. Verse 26, and build an altar unto the Lord thy God upon the top of this rock. So he's supposed to tear down the false altars, but then he is to replace them with a true altar. What do we see here? We see the replacement principle. Now, when we get rid of something bad in our life, what happens? It leaves a void. There's a hole there, right? And we could look at a bunch of examples of this. I think of one of the mistakes that I made over and over again as a young person was I would go to a youth conference, or I'd go to a youth camp, or I'd hear a good message preached at church, and my heart would get convicted over some of the music. Now, I didn't listen to the heavy metal, Satan worshiping type stuff, but I love me some country music, you know, and I love me some soft pop stuff, you know, and I was into that stuff, but you know, it wasn't that bad. That was the thing I heard. It wasn't that bad, but I'd be convicted in a service. And so I'd go down boo-hooing at the altar, and I'd say, Lord, please forgive me. I shouldn't have it in my life. There's no there's no room for that. I give it to you. And so you know what I would do? I'd give it to God. Here's my bad music, God. What happened? I'd go throughout my day and I'd find myself, oh, I can't sing that. I gave that to God. Oh, I can't listen to that on the radio. I gave that to God. Oh, I got to get rid of that cassette. All right? I gave that to God. Right? But what happened every time I got there? There was something missing. There was an emptiness. There was a void there. What did I need to do? And I found out this was my mistake. I wouldn't replace what I took away with something that was good. See, when you have a void, you have to put something that's good. So if you get rid of bad music, guess what you replace it with? Some good music. What is good music? I used to get tired of answering that question as a youth pastor. What is good music? And I would go through a whole list. This is good music, this is good music. Forget it. It changes too fast. Good music is music that honors God. There it is. That's the definition. That's the only definition you need. So when you get rid of the bad music, the music that doesn't honor God, you replace it with the good music, the music that does honor God. What are some other examples? I think about the friends maybe that you had before you made things right with God. Most of the time, you don't have to get rid of them, by the way. If you get really right with God, you don't get rid of friends. They get rid of you, all right? But you got to replace them, right? You got to replace them. You got to find some good friends to be around. The wrong places. Things I used to do, the places I used to go, I don't do them anymore. Well, where do you go now? You better go to some good places. You better do something with that time that you used to spend in that area. And then what about our talents? You know, some people are given wonderful talents by God, but somehow they go down the wrong path and they start using them for wrong. But then they get their heart right with the Lord, and then what do you do with those talents? You use them for the Lord. That's what you do. It's a replacement principle. We cannot forget that. When the bad is removed, leaves a void, we got to replace it with something that is good. We have to be intentional about this. By the way, notice how intentional Gideon was about this new altar. Look again at verse 26. And build an altar unto the Lord thy God where? Upon the top of this rock in the ordered place. This place, this rock was not the same place that he offered a present to God back in verse 18. No, that present that he offered to God on that altar that he built, that was done in secret. He was hiding. Nobody else was around. That was just between him and God. This was not the same rock. This was to be done upon the top of this rock. In other words, it's somewhere where everybody can see. It's an altar that's out there. It's in the public. It's not in secret. Why was it out in the open? So that everybody would be reminded that it was Jehovah God that should be worshipped, not Baal. Jehovah God needs to be worshipped. By the way, the Bible shows us that God wants us to be obvious when we worship him. Jesus said in Matthew 10:32, whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess also before my Father which is in heaven. God doesn't want us to be undercover Christians. No matter where we are, on the job, at school, in our neighborhood, in our own family, God wants you to be who you are. Who are you? You're a little Christ. And God wants you to let other people know it. Let everybody know that we're standing from him. Don't be ashamed. I love what Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. This altar was to be built. It was to be built in public. And it was also, thirdly, it was to be used. The last part of verse 26, and take the second bullock and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove which thou shalt cut down. He was to offer this second bullock. Notice the number of years. Some commentators have said that the 7 years corresponds to the number of years that they were in captivity or oppression by the Midianites. So one for every year. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's what God has intended there. But I do know this. I see an awesome picture. You say, what picture, preacher? Well, a sacrifice brings about relief from oppression. You see that? This sacrifice that I'm making to God is the starting point of relieving the oppression of the Midianites. What other sacrifice do you know that's been given down through history that has delivered folks from oppression. The greatest sacrifice that's ever been given was the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross of Calvary for your sins and my sins, and he took the oppression of sin off of us. What a picture. So first of all, these orders were very specific. They were very clear. Secondly, these orders had a purpose. The underlying reason for giving Gideon these orders was to emphasize the truth that if the Israelites' problem was going to be dealt with, it was going to be solved, then the cause of their problem had to be dealt with, not the effects of the problem. You say, what are you talking about? Well, Israel had a great problem, and that was they were being oppressed by the Midianites. That's what was on everybody's mind, but that wasn't the root cause of the problem. They were just a consequence. They were just an effect of the real problem. What was the real problem? They had gone away from God. They were involved in idolatry. They were worshiping false gods, particularly Baal and Ashtaroth. You know, a lot of folks never get the help that they need because they want to compromise in this one area right here. You say, what area? Well, they want the altar of God in their life. And at the same time, they want the altars of the world in their life. And they try to have a mixture of both. And when something happens, they say, well, I'm serving God. I got God in my life, so that means he's got to answer, he's got to give me solutions. He's got to take care of my problem. It doesn't work like that. You can't have God and have the world at the same time. The combination just doesn't work. I was reading something that Chuck Swindoll said years ago. He tells a story about a man living in Atlanta who was looking through a list of restaurants in the area, and he noticed one of the places listed was called the Church of God Grill. And so his curiosity got the best of him, and so he called the number, and a man answered. He said, hello, Church of God Grill. And so he asked the man who answered the phone, he said, tell me about how did you get such an unusual name? And the man answered, well, we had this little mission down here, and so we started selling chicken dinners after church on Sunday to help pay the bills. And people loved the chicken so much that we found ourselves shortening the time of the services so we'd have enough time to fix enough plates to feed all the people. He said, well, after a while, we just closed the church down altogether and just served chicken dinners. But we decided to keep the name that we started with, and that's Church of God Grill. What were they doing? They were trying to hold the hand of God and the hand of the world at the same time. And it doesn't work. You remember what Jesus said? He said, no man can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. God made it plain to Gideon. Gideon, it has to hit home with you first. You're going to be the leader. You better believe this. It's God or Baal. It can't be God and Baal. It doesn't work like that. I'm not going to bless you like that. And so that's the purpose of these orders, is to get the message across to Gideon first so he can get the message across to his family so that he can get the message across to the rest of the people of Israel. Number 3, these orders were to be carried out in a certain place. Before Gideon, he was sometime. Before Gideon could reform a nation, he had to reform his own family. And the basic principle is what Jesus taught, Matthew chapter 7. He said, why beholdest thou the mote that's in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? In other words, Gideon, you clean up your own backyard first. You take care of that first before you start dealing with the neighbor's backyard. You deal with the sin in your own life. Gideon must have been guilty of some of this as well. We know his father was. We know the rest of his family was. He must have been guilty somewhat. Maybe not as much, but maybe he just went along with it. Maybe he wasn't all in, but he just kind of went along with it. I don't know. So here's what it comes down to. God told Gideon exactly what to do. But here's the question. Will Gideon do it? To his credit, he did. He said yes. So let's look at how Gideon obeyed. Verse 27, notice how quickly Gideon obeyed. Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had said unto him. Notice the word then. Then emphasizes the promptness of his obedience. God spoke to Gideon. Gideon acted. He acted right away. He didn't procrastinate. He didn't argue. He didn't refuse. Folks, if we're ever going to accomplish anything worthwhile for God, anything great for Him, we got to obey and obey right away. We can't procrastinate. We can't put it off. Why? Because there's a chance that an opportunity may not be there anymore. Has God ever spoken to your heart about speaking up for Him to somebody? And you said, you know what, I ought to talk to that person about Him. Maybe you're at family, or what is it, Dollar General. Or maybe wherever, and God said you ought to speak to that person. And you say, you know what, let me go over here and get a bottle of aspirin, and I'll be right back, and I'm going to talk. And when you got back, they weren't there. Ooh, that opportunity is gone. You'll never get that opportunity back again. That's the chance that we take every time when we delay our obedience to God. Gideon said, okay, God, that's what you want me to do? Let's go do it. And so many times, here's the crazy thing about it, so many times we play the hypocrite here. When we ask God to do something for us, what do we expect? Right now, right? I expect you to answer right now. Don't delay. Don't put it off. But yet when God asks us to do something, how quick are we to respond? You know, we complain about God. We talk about, we think, well, He's just not being faithful to His promise. We may not say it verbally, but we think it. I wonder if God, He could complain about us all the time, couldn't He? Because we don't say yes right away. We're not obedient to Him right away. Listen, God's always on time. It's us that are not so quick to answer. The lesson is we need to be quick to answer and obey. Now, when God asks us to do something, this is important. It may not be easy. All right, that's a good thing to know, right? When God asks us to do something, it may not be easy. Matter of fact, obedience is hard work sometimes. Verse 27 says Gideon took how many men with him? 10 men. This was a big job to do. The altar of Baal, you remember what it was made out of? Stone. Big, huge pieces of rock that had to be moved. That's hard work. More work than Gideon could do by himself. Cutting down those groves. He didn't have chainsaws. He had to get them, probably some type of axe or something that he used to cut down all of them. To pile up that wood and to move it from place to place. That's going to take a lot of energy. And so he gets others to help him to do it. Living for God is not an easy thing, and we shouldn't pretend that it is. We want people to get saved. We want people to get saved desperately. And a lot of times we'll say things that is not so true. Oh, you get saved, it's wonderful. I'm telling you, it is. Oh, you will love it when you're saved. I'll tell you what, you'll just get up every morning, you'll be ready. Is that really what the Christian life is? No, the Christian life, and I'm not saying you ought to do this. Oh, no, you don't want to get saved, man. It's hard. No, you don't want to do that either. But let's be real. Let's be truthful in what we say. Let's not sugarcoat. The Christian life is hard sometimes. It does take a lot of strength, a lot of stamina, a lot of dedication to obey God. And there's many days that it's a struggle to follow God's will. But let me just say this. When we're obedient to God, it may be difficult, but the rewards that we are compensated with, it goes well beyond anything that we'll ever go through. And I'm not talking about the rewards that we're going to get to heaven, although I'm looking forward to those rewards, aren't you? I'm looking forward to, first of all, seeing what they're like. What are they? What are they going to, how is it all going to play out? I hope I get some. How about you? I hope I have one or two that I can, hey, look what I got. And maybe go over to Brother Bob and say, hey, what'd you get? And maybe we can compare. I don't know. I'm looking forward to that. But those are not the rewards I'm talking about. I'm talking about the rewards that we get here and now. Right here on this earth. The blessings that He gives us for enduring those hard times and being obedient to Him. Annie Johnson Flint was a hymn writer, a poem writer, years and years ago. Her life, you could never say this about her life, that it was one of comfort and one of ease. It was quite the contrary. From childhood, her body was wrecked through rheumatoid arthritis. Matter of fact, it got to the place where she couldn't even get up out of bed. The only comfort that she had when she was growing up was to get soft pillows, just pillow after pillow, and to put those all around her in bed. Because of that, she got bed sores all over her body. She had to endure that. Later on in her life, she got cancer on top of that. I mean, it just seemed like one thing after another, but through it all, she remained faithful. She remained obedient to God. I love her attitude that she expressed in a hymn. It's found in your hymn book. And you might be facing something tonight, or maybe you know somebody who is, and maybe you could point them to this hymn in your hymn book, but I hope the words are encouragement to you. Listen to the words. He giveth more grace. You've heard it. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the laborers increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. Here's the chorus. His love has no limit. His grace has no measure. His power has no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again. Listen to the second verse. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our faith has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full given is only begun. And look who that came from. That came from somebody who had been through it. She knew what she was talking about. So let me ask you these questions tonight. Have you decided that you're going to live for God no matter what comes against you? Have you decided that? I don't care what comes. I'm going to live for God no matter what. Have you decided that you're going to obey God no matter what he asks you to do? Now, preacher, you're not asking me to do that, are you? I mean, he might ask me to do this. Have you come to a place in your life you told God, whatever, you ask me, I'll do it. When the going gets rough, when life gets tough, are you going to be obedient or not? That's the question. That's the question that God posed to Gideon. I believe he posed it to him the first time that he met him. But surely the second time when he gave him some orders to carry. Okay, let's test you, Gideon. You know what? There might be some testing for all of us this week. We might be tested to see whether or not we're going to be obedient. Oh, yeah, it's easy to say it in church. It's easy to say, oh, yeah, God, let's go, man. I'm ready to go right now, whatever. Well, what about if the test comes this week? What if it's usually something that hits home. It's not a test if it doesn't. It's not a test if it's not a struggle. So when the test comes, are we going to be obedient? Would you bow your heads with me tonight?